Okay, so you've no doubt heard the term peer-reviewed journal article plenty of times, but just to be clear, when you hear this, it's referring to a finished, fairly permanent written outcome from some research effort that generally includes some background and reason for that research, some info on how they carried it out, like their methodology, some sort of results if new data was collected, and a conclusion tying it all together, acknowledging limitations, stuff like that. So peer-reviewed means the work was checked by multiple independent experts in that field of study. And the process of peer review, it can take months often, usually, partly because peer reviewers are other busy researchers who do this all on a volunteer basis for no compensation, but also because peer review often sends the paper back to the authors to do a bunch of revisions, to fix any errors, maybe even do a new experiment and collect additional data, change how they do the statistical analysis to make that better, make them acknowledge limitations or possible confounds in their methodology, as well as removing exaggerated wording and claims, and so on. Then, if the peer reviewers and editor are all satisfied with the changes, then it might be published in a journal. Now, there are actually quite a few types of peer-reviewed journal articles that you'll run into, but the most common are an empirical article, meaning they collected some new data or are sharing some new results. This is the stereotypical science research, testing something by collecting data. You'll often see a tag on the article making it clear this is an empirical article, sometimes with the term like research report or registered report, brief report, original research, something like that, which is to distinguish it from another type of peer-reviewed journal article that you're going to run into a lot, which is a review article. This is a paper that just systematically summarizes a lot of other previous studies on a specific topic. Usually this means kind of highlighting all the work that's been done on the topic recently, and the review article might be organized in a few sections covering, recent research into one aspect of the topic, and then recent research into another aspect of the topic, and so on. The other common article type you might run into is a meta-analysis. Think of this like a review article that does some statistics on the past research that it's been systematically reviewing. So it's kind of like a review article. It looks at a bunch of research done by other people already. But in this case, they go a little further. They use techniques to statistically combine that data from all those old studies, either to come to an overall conclusion on whether an effect is real, or perhaps just to get a much more accurate estimate of an effect size. Since, a single study might give us a pretty noisy or inaccurate guess of just how big an effect size is. Now, often when you're searching a journal article database, you can sort, you can filter to show specifically just a meta-analysis like this, or just review papers if that's what you want, or whatever type of article you're looking for. Now, there is another type of article you might run into, although it's less common, and that's theoretical articles. Basically, someone arguing for or against a particular theory or for a particular interpretation of the data on a given topic. This usually doesn't involve doing any new data collection. You might even think of this as just a special type of review article, but it's maybe less interested in systematically representing the recent research altogether on a topic and more focused on making a specific point or establishing where they think future research should go. Now, this list doesn't have every type of peer-reviewed journal article because there are some other types like methodological articles that describe some new method or new equipment. But these ones here are the ones you'll see most often when searching for science on any topic you're interested in. Now, there are also some other things you might see in a database or even in a peer-reviewed journal itself, but some of which isn't actually peer-reviewed in the normal way. So you might see something labeled letter to the editor or just letter, and that's kind of like the opinion column of a newspaper, though it'll be written by an established researcher in the field. But it doesn't go through peer review. It just gets maybe looked over by the journal editor, and it indeed may have some more kind of opinion within it rather than sticking to the research completely like peer-reviewed articles generally do. Now, a letter might call for, increased funding to a particular area of research, or it might be condemning the sloppy statistical practices found in a recent issue of that journal. Another thing you might see sometimes is an article labeled commentary, or labeled reply, usually like commentary on X, or reply to Y, where it refers to a full peer-reviewed journal article that came in that same issue of the journal, or maybe in a recent issue of the journal. This is like a formal way of criticizing or defending some work that got a lot of attention or a lot of press, or maybe came to a contentious conclusion. But whether these commentaries are peer-reviewed themselves, that kind of depends on the journal. Usually it's more like the commentaries are like an extra bit of peer review that people have put out, but they themselves were just looked over by an editor. They are kind of public peer review that's going on, maybe to critique a contentious article or something like that. So you get more voices in there as a reader as well. All right, at any rate, what I want to do now is show you some specific examples of kind of how to spot out in the wild what type of article you're looking at. So let's say you're doing a search of a database. You might run into something like this. Let's start with this one on some comparative cognition research in mouse problem solving. Now, notice the little label up top by the title saying it's a research report. So that tells you this is an empirical article. And indeed, if you glance down at the abstract, you can see that they're telling you about how data was collected in this study. They had mice pulling a string hanging from the top of a testing cage. So it's an empirical article, there's new data being reported. Or there's this article about a parasite called toxoplasma that some research suggests has an effect on cognition in rats and probably also in humans. Note in the top left this little label, research article, suggesting again this is probably an empirical article, not a review article. And if we glance at the abstract, again it says this study tested the effect of neurotransmitter changes. So they were collecting new data, they were doing a test. It's an empirical article. Now here's another example where, again, it's clearly labeled, so original investigation up top there. So this is an empirical article. It's sharing original data on the topic of, in this case, hindsight bias in radiologists. And then the abstract down below, you can see they're talking about 16 radiologists that were asked to do a task. So obviously this is reporting new data. It's empirical. Another example here on relationships and orgasm faking, where they labeled it again up top, original research. And even if they didn't have that label up there, if you didn't see it, you can see that the abstract is talking about some methodology they did of how they collected data and who the participants were. So it's an empirical article. Another example here on video games for education, and it's labeled research article rather than, review article or something like that. And again, you get a little peek into the abstract there of what they did, and it seems like they collected new data. In this case, qualitative data, so just stuff like, interviews, but that's still empirical work, not just summarizing previous research from prior journal articles. This is new data that they're bringing to the table. You might occasionally even see a label like this that says registered report. That's another term for an empirical article. So they are reporting new data. But it's a special label that's actually really cool because it tells you this whole study was pre-registered, meaning the researchers submitted the entire plan, including writing up the introduction and the hypotheses, but also the exact plan for their methodology and the statistical analyses they would do. Basically, they got their whole method and statistical analysis peer-reviewed ahead of time and approved ahead of time before they even collected the data. And the journal agreed that they would publish the results whatever the data ended up looking like. So not just if the results are sexy and new, even if they're kind of boring, we're agreeing to publish this because it's good science. So pre-registering a study ensures that the researchers can't, change their mind partway through or do a different analysis on their data or make adjustments to their method along the way, since that could theoretically add some bias to the results if the researchers aren't careful. So pre-registered work, like the example here, these are often stronger papers. They can be trusted at maybe an even higher level than standard peer-reviewed articles. And this is becoming more common, by the way, for all articles in the big important journals. Okay. Then there's ones like this article on nostalgia in video games. If you glance through the abstract at the bottom here, it's talking about the topic of video games, but nothing in here so far about specific data collection methodology or new specific results that they are reporting on themselves. They even say at the bottom here they are describe and explain. They're describing and explaining the topic of nostalgia, not that they're testing something directly themselves. And sure enough, look at the label up top and you'll see this is a review article, not an empirical article. So it's summarizing the research on a particular topic rather than adding new data. Or how about this one? An entry found when searching on the topic of memory on the PubMed database that I use a lot. It's about working memory, and the abstract seems to be, describing the working memory system, but it doesn't mention anything about participants or conditions they assigned people to. And indeed, once again, we've got a clue with the label up top that this is a review article, not an empirical article. Here's another example in the Journal of Neuroendocrinology, a review article on gender identity and sexual orientation that it just goes over past and especially recent research on that topic. And again, it's fairly clearly labeled. It's a review article. So what about this one then? Well, now there's no label in the top left near the title that'll tell us if it's original data or a review article, but notice in the title itself, they tell you this is a meta-analysis. That's actually pretty common to see the title actually says meta-analysis. And you can see in the abstract, they tell you the methods was to conduct a meta-analysis of studies, in this case comparing theory of mind abilities in those with major depressive disorder and some healthy controls. So they are seeking out all the previous studies that did a particular type of test, depressed people versus non-depressed control group, comparing their theory of mind. Then here they're going to report an overall effect size when statistically combining across all those studies they found. So that's the big bit here of results previewed in the abstract. The D equals 0.51 to 0.58. That's an effect size measure, Cohen's D. So here's another example of a meta-analysis. Again, the title makes clear what kind of peer-reviewed article this is. It's a meta-analysis, but also in the abstract they say, in the present meta-analysis, and then they tell you what studies they're combining the results of and what they found when combining the results of those studies. Okay, so at this point, we've seen examples of the most common types of peer-reviewed articles, which are empirical articles, review articles, and meta-analyses. As I said, you may occasionally run into articles that don't fit into these three categories, like this one on the size constancy theory of visual illusions. One key here is the word theory in the title. So this is a theoretical article, and in the abstract, they make it clear they're like criticizing a view, basically arguing for or against an interpretation or a particular hypothesis or a specific theory. Here they talk about criticizing a couple of times. They suggest an interpretation that has been overemphasized. So you can see how this is a theoretical article rather than sharing new data or just giving an objective review of recent work on a topic. Here's one more example, but this time of something that wasn't necessarily peer-reviewed. Depending on the journal, it may have just been reviewed by an editor, who again is an academic researcher who's working in that field and doing the editing for the journal as an unpaid volunteer. But unlike peer review, this doesn't necessarily go out to like 3 other independent experts in addition to the editor, since in this case it's just a letter and usually making some brief point of response or critique. All right, so now that we've seen some clear examples of each type of peer-reviewed journal article, let's actually practice the skill, giving it a try yourself, seeing what you can spot. So I'm going to show an article screenshot for a whole bunch of examples and ask you to pause the video each time and try and identify what type of article it is. Then after you unpause, I'll give the answer. It helps to really practice this yourself, so don't cheat. You ready? Let's try it. So pause this one and decide before unpausing. Here it is not labeled, but you can tell from the abstract they had 224 subjects giving ratings on fake personality profiles to see if those people thought the fake profiles were accurate about themselves. That means they were collecting new data. This is an empirical article, in this case about how people might fall for, things like astrology or whatever. Okay, all right, let's try another one. Again, pause and guess before unpausing. Okay, this one is empirical as well. The title is suggestive since it's telling us some factual claim that presumably implies data was collected to come to that conclusion, but the abstract makes it even more clear. They performed 3 studies, they talk about what they found, they say, we found the psychological, entitled was positively correlated with anger and bad luck, so we've got new data here and results. It's an empirical article. Okay, let's try another one. Pause and guess. So this one doesn't have a label near the top, but the title tells you what it is. The title says it's a meta-analysis. And again, in the abstract, there's an objectives bit that says, we conducted a meta-analysis to examine the effectiveness of these interventions. So basically, they found other past research that had looked into the effects of social media and health apps on pregnancy care. And in this paper, they statistically combine that information. How about this one? Pause and guess before unpausing. So here we've got another empirical article. They talk about this study using a laboratory-based procedure to study superstitious belief. They describe the task in the lab that people did, and they're talking about the results they found, so it's an empirical article. Okay, how about this one? Pause and guess. Okay, so we've got a review article here. Notice the title already kind of hints at this idea that you're just going to get a summary of recent research on a topic. And even up above the title, you see this is published in a journal called Current Opinions on Neurobiology. So likely this journal focuses on review articles and theoretical articles, not necessarily new empirical data. So here we've got a review article. All right, let's try another. Pause and guess. Okay, so this one describes the methodology of how they tested this stuff. If you read through the abstract, they mention findings across multiple studies they did in this paper. They tell us what they found. They mention these results, blah, 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 and our results, blah, blah, blah. So this is an empirical article. It's new data. Okay, how about this one? Pause and try. So this one isn't a laboratory study. Instead, they mentioned doing a survey of 1,975 male athletes to ask about disordered eating, but that means they collected new data. Even if it's just correlational data, they collected data. That is clearly an empirical article. Now pause and try this one. So I hid the article title to see if you could do it with just the abstract alone. There's some complex stuff and big words in here, but the second sentence clearly says, therefore, we adopted a meta-analytic approach. And they talk about calculating something from 24 previous studies that involved 977 participants in those other studies. So it's a meta-analysis rather than collecting new sleep data. How about this one? Pause and try. So this isn't a laboratory study. Instead, they mentioned doing a survey of male athletes, and they ask about disordered eating. Wait, did that one already? Okay. Here we go. Okay, now try this one. Sorry. We've got an article here about sexual effects of Molly, and notice they talk about specifically studying 35 healthy users and asking about 4 specific areas of sexual activity. They give results from those subjects, so it's an empirical article. How about this one? Pause and try. Okay, so the title here might hint that we're going to read some new evidence on this topic, but the abstract makes it even more clear. They measured variables to get a correlation in this case, the sentiments found in influencer videos and in the comments on those videos. So they're reporting specific results on that new collected data, finding significant emotional contagion here. So it's an empirical article. Let's pause and try another. Okay, so this one I only gave you the title, so maybe we can't be 100% sure, but it mentions the relationship between some variables during and after a 12-month program, which suggests this is probably an empirical article reporting data collected during and after a program, that program. How about this one? Pause and try. So this one is clearly an empirical article. It talks about at-home testing of 20 healthy adults, describes the intervention and the results they got very clearly. It even says in the title it is a randomized controlled trial, meaning this is a true experimental design where people were randomized into groups to test the effects of an independent variable. In this case, the independent variable was blue light exposure, like either normal or blocking it with special glasses, and they found that blocking blue light didn't do anything. Basically, blue light doesn't have an effect on sleep time or sleep quality, contrary to common claims. Okay, how about this one on horse therapy? Pause and try. Notice in the objective part of the abstract, they say they're examining other peer-reviewed research on the topic. And in the method bit of the abstract here, they tell us they looked at 14 other peer-reviewed studies. But there's nothing here about statistically combining those. And the results bit doesn't give some overall effect size, like Cohen's d or something, combining all the studies. So they seem to just be summarizing and describing past research. So this is a review article. All right, pause and try this one. So I feel a little bad here, but this was a trick question. This one is not a peer-reviewed journal article. It is a press release, basically a little news article put out by the PR people at some university to tell the press and the public about some work that was done at their university. So yeah, it's describing a peer-reviewed journal article, and hopefully at the bottom they link to the real journal article. But here, this is a secondary source, not a primary source. About halfway down, you even see the little paragraph saying, the findings appear in the July 25th issue of the journal, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So that's where the actual peer-reviewed journal article showed up. Even if Summaries like this are well written and accurate. They are not the same as the original primary source. So make sure you know how to find the real research paper if you want to verify whether the descriptions here or in other news articles are accurate about the research, or if the news kind of made things overblown or exaggerated the hype. All right, let's pause and try another one. This one is an empirical article. Again, because you can spot in the abstract, they're going to tell us about 2 experiments they did, and they're describing the results of experiment 1, and later how the method was changed for experiment 2. So this one's empirical. Let's do at least a few more. So again, pause and try this one. This one actually has the label up top near the left top part where you see the word review in all caps. So in the abstract here, you can also see he's talking about past research and also recent studies challenging the old view. You might also notice near the end he's talking about putting forward a particular hypothesis. So this could probably be classified as a theoretical article, as a sort of, type of review article, one type of review article, if that makes sense. So it's a review, and within that review, he's using the recent research to argue for like an updated view or an updated hypothesis. Okay, how about this one? Pause and try. Okay, sorry, this was another trick question. This is definitely not a peer-reviewed journal article, even though it's describing a real study and does mention where the study was published in a peer-reviewed journal article called Aesthetic Plastic Surgery. But what we see here is just a news article, or maybe a blog post. So again, this is not a primary source. This is just a secondary source telling us about some journal article rather than seeing the journal article itself here. Okay, pause and try this one then. So this is another one that's clearly not sharing new data. So it's not empirical, and there's nothing about statistically summarizing a bunch of other articles, so it doesn't seem like it's a meta-analysis either. What we have here is another review article. And indeed, the journal it's published in is apparently called Psychological Review, as you can see in the reference there. And in the abstract, near the end, he says he's proposing that the phrase intervening variable only be used in some circumstances. So it sounds like this is specifically a theoretical article. So like a type of review article that's pushing for a specific point at the end. Okay, try this one now. So we've got research on dogs interacting with something like robot or, an AI assistant, it seems. And it says they evaluated an artificial agent, and they're telling us how puppies responded and about statistical significance or the lack thereof. So this is definitely an empirical article. How about this one? Pause and try. So once more, I threw a press release in here rather than a peer-reviewed article. Notice it's credited to Peter Dzycki's at MIT news office. So someone at MIT, not a researcher, someone at MIT who works in their press area is putting this out because some researcher at MIT had recently published a study. Now the MIT PR people are putting out a press release to the news describing it to make their university look better. So we're looking here at a secondary source, not the primary source. This is not a peer-reviewed journal article. All right, pause and try this one. Well, right below the title, it says this is original research. So that alone is enough to tell us we've got an empirical article, even if we can't see the abstract. They're going to report some original data they collected. And now try this one. Yeah, you probably guessed it by now, but this is not a peer-reviewed journal article. It is describing one. It's telling us about a study that was published in somewhere else, in JAMA Psychiatry, so the Journal of the American Medical Association Psychiatry. So that is the peer-reviewed article in question, but what we have here is just a news article about the fact that that peer-reviewed article is out there somewhere. So specifically, this is a press release from Yale, talking about work done by a Yale professor at the Yale Child Study Center. And as you can see, in the very top in the small print there, suggests this was found on the Yale School of Medicine's website, not a peer-reviewed journal. And indeed, here's the actual article from that press release we saw in the last slide. So this is the primary source. This is the actual peer-reviewed work. This is what we would read if we wanted to cite this work, rather than someone else's secondary description, which can often introduce a bunch of errors or leave out limitations or kind of, hype things up. The news is full of hype. But often peer-reviewed articles, they have to be careful to reduce hype, to use careful wording, to be more precise, since the peer review process forces the authors to write in a more accurate and careful way than news writing can be. All right, that should be plenty of examples. Now, hopefully you have an idea what to look for when you're doing a literature search on some topic of interest, so that you can, at a glance, figure out if a peer-reviewed article is the right type for what you want. Sometimes a review article is nice because it gives a good overview of the topic and kind of a feeling of what's been found across many studies. But often an empirical article is better because it gives you all the specifics about how exactly this research is done on this topic, including the particular methodology they used, and that lets you apply your own critical thinking to see if you should really believe their conclusions or, come to your own conclusions about it. Maybe you don't like the way that they operationalize the variables. You think they oversimplified things or it's not really representative. Often you can only get into those nitty-gritty details if you read the original empirical work. But that means the first thing you need to do is identify exactly what you're looking at, like when you're searching through a database of articles, so you know if it's a meta-analysis or some new data or just a crotchety rant and a letter to the editor.